Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy retires, kicking off a battle for a key seat on the nation's highest court. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. To understand what's happening today with the Supreme Court, we must turn back to 1987, when liberal interest groups won one of their most consequential battles as the Senate voted down the nomination of a conservative hero, Judge Robert Bork, to be on the Supreme Court. The seat he was nominated to fill was eventually filled by Anthony Kennedy, a weather-vane justice who voted for decisions that forced states to recognize same-sex marriages and that upheld the court's creation of a right to have elective abortions. But Justice Kennedy also voted for decisions this week that upheld the Trump administration's power to temporarily exclude nationals from certain foreign countries from the United States, and that ended government worker unions' power to force non-members to pay union fees. Then yesterday, that court seat opened again as Justice Kennedy announced his retirement after 30 years on the Supreme Court. The battle over whoever President Trump chooses to nominate will be furious and fiercely partisan, with interest groups on both sides trying to affect judicial policy for decades to come. So, Mike, let's start with that 1987 battle that the younger listeners won't even have heard of and remember.
I was not alive. I was literally not alive. But I think when you're trying to set the stakes of what's going to happen over this coming summer, I think looking back to 1987 very well establishes the stakes. The left liberals organized very strongly to defeat I think it is reasonable and fair, you knew Judge Bork, to call him a very staunch conservative.
Yes, well, and he was announced, he was the leading conservative constitutional scholar of his day, and he was a Marine in not one but two wars, World War II and Korea. He signed up at the age of 17 to join the Marine Corps after seeing the commandant to say right after, as the Battle of Iwo Jima was going on, "We will take Mount Suribachi if it takes every last Marine." So, unsurprisingly, he was a combative gentleman, and as well as a brilliant legal theorist. To this day, he completely rewrote antitrust law effectively just by his arguments as a University of Chicago law professor. And he also had famously carried out the Saturday Night Massacre firing of Special Counsel Archibald Cox that President Richard Nixon
on behalf of Nixon at the
height of Watergate.
Yes, the train that ultimately led to Nixon's resignation in lieu of impeachment kind of begins with the Saturday Night Massacre and the firing of Archibald Cox.
Yes, and one of Bork's books is his own internal memoir about that time. He almost resigned rather than carry out the order, but the two people above him, he was the Solicitor General, and the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General above him had resigned because they wouldn't do this. He was tortured about it because he didn't think it was right to fire Cox, but he was persuaded by friends that, look, if you go, then the Justice Department's completely headless, and that doesn't make things better for those of us who want to contain Mr. Nixon, so you've got to do this. And between that and his combative legal arguments, he was easily despised by the left.
And very strong social conservatism.
Yeah, and social conservatism on top of all that. So that within minutes of the announcement that he had been nominated, which was not particularly a surprise that he was, Ted Kennedy was on the Senate floor.
This is Ted Kennedy of the waitress sandwiches with Senator Chris Dodd, for the record.
Yes, a man of very little moral standing himself, but he delivered a vicious speech for an extended period about how in Judge Bork's America, blacks won't be served at lunch counters and scurrilous, incredible smears that launched this whole wave of attacks. Bork's nomination was delayed longer than any had ever been delayed by far. This is the first really, the point is all this is the first vicious fight.
Right. The Bork nomination and the fight over it begins the modern era of Supreme Court judicial nominations that end in the fierce partisanship that we are going to see over the next couple of months. And that brings us into the groups that fought then and still fight now. You have mentioned that leading Leading the charge against Bork was a group called People for the American Way, led by Hollywood TV producer Norman Lear. At the time, back in the 80s, they spent the then unheard of sum on an advocacy campaign of $1.5 million to rally liberals and progressives in both parties, it must be said, because this was before the full sorting of liberals and conservatives into the two political parties, to defeat Bork's nomination.
That's correct. He did finally go down. Now, it's again, if you want that story from Bork's perspective, pick up his book, The Tempting of America, which the last part of which is his description of the battle. I can tell you, as somebody who knows the Borks, that some years later, Mr. Justice Kennedy told the family when he bumped into
Mr. Justice
them,
Kennedy,
or sorry,
or
not
the,
Mr.
yeah,
no, I apologize, I misspoke. Sorry. Senator Ted Kennedy.
The Senator Ted Kennedy, who never hurt anyone in his life. Ha ha ha.
Yes. He some years later shrugged his shoulders and said, nothing personal. But
one wonders if he said the same thing to Mary Jo Kopechne.
Yes, but in any event, it was a very vicious battle, and it was also the making of People for the American Way, which was the leading group, as you said. They recruited famous Hollywood liberals at the time, like Gregory Peck, who back then was still alive and a famous movie star. And if you want to know more about People for the American Way, this is a classic example of where InfluenceWatch.org can be helpful, because you can look up the People for the American Way, you can look up People for the American Way Foundation, People for the American Way Action Fund, People for the American Way Voters Alliance, and Young People For, a project of People for the American Way. Now, I would throw in another thing that's shocking in retrospect. Among the founders, with Norman Lear for People for the American Way, was Father Theodore Hesburgh, then the very famous president of Notre Dame and longtime president of Notre Dame. Not something I think he would want to be talking to St. Peter about when he met him at the pearly gates, but in any event, I throw that in there because Justice Kennedy eventually takes this seat, and Justice Kennedy is Catholic, and in fact, until Scalia's death a year or two ago here, it was 6 Catholics on the court and 3 Jews. And Nina Totenberg, NPR's left-wing commentator on the court, made the very interesting point that in some ways the splits on the court was an internecine Catholic split. To a considerable extent. Now, Gorsuch now makes this a wild card because he was raised Catholic. He apparently attends an Episcopal church, but it's not completely clear whether he
appears to be a Protestant. But now we've discussed a little bit about Mr. Justice Kennedy, who is stepping down. He was not even the second choice of President Reagan for the vacancy created by the resignation of Lewis Powell. Instead, we had Judge Douglas Ginsburg. He was defeated. He withdrew his name because he had apparently smoked marijuana in college, which tells you you about where we've
twice.
Yeah. And so,
he wasn't during his college. He was a college professor.
He was a university professor. But anyway, so his withdrawal for doing something that is now legal in 10 states, I think, has led to the nomination of Anthony Kennedy. And then Kennedy was confirmed and has served on the court for, I believe, now 30 years, and he is now stepping down.
That's correct. And we should now talk a bit about the differences between Kennedy and Bork. Now, I will say again, I knew Bork. We both worked at the American Enterprise Institute for a number of years together, and he had been on the second highest court in the land, which was the Court of Appeals.
Yeah, the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, which all the federal administrative law, any decisions of federal
policy,
decisions of the federal bodies, National Labor Relations Board, Federal Communications Commission, they're all routed through the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is extremely powerful, and in one of the decisions by the political branches that set the tone for the summer that is to come, Harry Reid got rid of the judicial filibuster so that he could put a bunch of former Senator Harry Reid, former Senate Democratic leader, majority leader before 2015, so that he could confirm by a simple majority vote, a vote of only his caucus, a bunch of President Obama's Democratic judges to the D.C. Circuit.
Because that is typically the batter's circle for people who are going to get
for people who are going to get who are going to potentially be nominated to the Supreme Court. And also, there's just so much administrative law that not every decision can be reviewed by the Supreme Court.
Yes. So Bork had been on that with everyone expecting him to get the elevation, and after he was defeated by the Senate, he soon stepped down from that and went back to AEI, where he had been many years before, which is how I got to know him. But for every year at the end of the Supreme Court's term, Bork would give a little talk to the AEI fellows on the year's Supreme Court decisions. And every year, of course, he was asked, how would you have voted differently from Justice Kennedy? And I can tell you, I remember the first 3 years, there was not a single decision, I don't believe, that Bork said he would have actually voted differently from Justice Kennedy. So that's an interesting thing. But at the same time, they were not precisely the same in their judicial philosophies. So tell us a bit about that.
Again, as you mentioned earlier, Bork was one of the first exponents and most prominent exponents of the strict constructionist, originalist, textualist. The legal people will finally parse those distinctions, but for our purposes, they're effectively synonymous. And Justice Kennedy, to the extent he developed a jurisprudence over his 30 years on the High Court, was a weather vane. It was Sarab Ahmari, who's a social conservative, writing at Commentary Magazine, called it a jurisprudence of balderdash. And of course, liberals attacked him as well, especially after he stepped down, despite Kennedy's vote handing them victories in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which secured for another 20 years the Supreme Court's creation of a right to abortion in Roe v. Wade, and Obergefell v. Hodges, which compelled the recognition of same-sex marriages. Despite that, Ian Millhiser, the legal fellow at the left-wing Center for American Progress Action Fund, called him a, quote, horrible justice. Kennedy, because he didn't really have a consistent ideology so far as any outside observer could discern, tended to he dispensed wins to both sides. Kind of was jokingly referred to as the emperor, because of course it was generally his position as the swing justice, certainly after the retirement of Sandra Day O'Connor in 2005. That he has been the majority maker, so by handing wins to both sides, he became very powerful and very prominent.
Yep. Now, as it happens, you mentioned Sandra Day O'Connor as a previous big swing vote, but also there was another swing vote that actually had held the seat before Kennedy.
Lewis Powell.
Yes.
Who was nominated by Nixon back in the 70s.
Yes, and also was a swing vote. So one of the things that's notable is that it would be hard to find a justice who was nominated by a Democrat president who ended up deeply disappointing his party, but it is easy to find justices nominated by Republicans.
And Kennedy is far from the least disappointing. David Souter probably sits in that seat. He was nominated by George H.W. Bush, and then ultimately basically became a core of the liberal bloc until he retired during Obama's first term.
Don't forget, however, going back even further from before when I was even born, you have Chief Justice Earl Warren, appointed by Eisenhower, who later said, biggest damn fool mistake I ever made.
Yeah, no, the Warren Court, of which Warren was a member of the progressive bloc, was sort of notoriously liberal.
Yep. Well, let's turn to some of the activist groups on both sides that are going to be big players in this fight. Although before saying that, the last thing I'll say on Kennedy, and I heard this from some well-placed friends at one of these important groups. They had always told me, and obviously they were telling the truth, that not only that Mr. Justice Kennedy saw himself when he looked in the mirror as a conservative Republican, but also that he absolutely was going, if it was in his power, he was going to be certain that he had himself replaced by a Republican. The Republicans elevated him. He felt obliged to allow the Republicans to replace him. And before that, Lewis Powell, as you say, was also a Republican seat.
No, and again, where the battle is going to be, what the stakes are. I think we may as well lay this out before. President Trump, of course, during the campaign, famously released a list of judicial candidates.
A couple dozen.
I think 24, 25 in a couple of flights. That, when I have, at this point, the vacancy created by the death of Antonin Scalia, which was later filled by Neil Gorsuch, who was on the list, was open, and it was a major campaign issue. So he puts out this list and says that, I will choose from this list. And then obviously chose Neil Gorsuch from the list. Now he said yesterday that he is going to choose the nominee for the Anthony Kennedy retirement vacancy from the same list. So the possibility is that you will, as with the nomination of Bork to replace Powell, that you will have a situation where a strong originalist conservative is to replace a swing justice. And that has raised the stakes in this fight, even in a way that they weren't for the Gorsuch-Scalia fight.
Yes, because Scalia
was a staunch originalist conservative. He was replaced by Neil Gorsuch, who at least after 2 terms appears to be a staunch originalist conservative.
Yep. Well, and actually, I'll throw out just a tidbit on why on the politics back then. Bork was not the first. The seat Bork was nominated for was not Reagan's first shot at the court.
No, I think it was his third, right?
Yeah, it was his third. The second. The first was Sandra Day O'Connor.
Yep. Sandra Day O'Connor, a moderate.
Yep, in the first term. And then there is Scalia. And people forget this, and it's kind of quaint these days, but Scalia sailed through the Senate, even though he was best friends with Judge Bork. But he didn't have the kind of paper trail and combativeness that Bork did, and B, he was the first Italian ever nominated to the court.
And not only was he the first Italian in 1980, he was nominated in 86, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. In 1986, the control of the Senate was with the Republicans. In 1987, it was with the Democrats. The fact of Senate control is going to become important later.
But it also is important that Reagan was then in the throes of the Iran-Contra scandal.
Yeah, also when Bork was in trouble, it was Iran-Contra.
Yeah, so the president had a lot less capital, whereas Scalia was 87 because it was almost immediately after Reagan wins. Or sorry, no. I'm screwing this up. Sorry. But anyway, it was not long after, I think it was 85.
Okay, but it was in the 85-86 Congress when the Republicans had the majority.
Yes, and Reagan had just been reelected.
Had just been reelected very strongly.
So he had enormous clout that way. But anyway, so let's start with the blue corner. You've talked about the People for the American Way, but there are other folks on the Democrat side in this fight as well, newer folks.
Well, let's start with the new guys. So as of a few months ago, there is a new social welfare advocacy group, dark money group in liberal speak, although they don't call their own groups dark money for some reason, and that is Demand Justice.
And by the way, they are protesting right this very moment.
Yeah. If you are watching this live, they are demonstrating in front of the Supreme Court
as we speak.
I was unable to see if they did the same thing that the liberal groups did when Gorsuch was nominated with the "We're against" blank space where they had handwritten in the name of the nominee. But anyway, so they were looking to raise $10 million, and to get an idea of who they're looking to raise
in this year.
To get an idea of who they're looking to raise money from, Brian Fallon, if that name is familiar, that's because he was the press secretary for the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and is the executive director, president of Demand Justice. He was at the Democracy Alliance meeting, and we've discussed the Democracy Alliance on this podcast before. The Democracy Alliance is the convening of major liberal donors, including such luminaries as George Soros, the Pritzker family,
Taco Bell heir,
Taco Bell heir Rob Stein, major institutional liberal donors like the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, the Service Employees International Union. So that's the kind of people who are propping up this campaign. And
again, it was started this very year.
Yes, started this very year. There have been rumors flying around Washington that Kennedy might retire. So they've spooled this up. in the anticipation of that possibility, and they kind of took a dry run at one of President Trump's nominees for a district court in North Carolina. And now, of course, they are spooled up for the big one.
Yep, and as you said, they're basically a lot of people out of the Clinton world, and then also
Clinton and Obama world,
and yes, also the Obama Justice Department world, and one of the other top staffers was the Democratic Senate Judiciary Committee top staffer as well. We have some reporters from our shop, the Capitol Research Center, who are at that protest now, and my suggestion to them was to say, are you worried that Senator Mitch McConnell is going to be helped by dark money in this fight? And then to say, and where does your money come from?
Yeah, funnily enough, the liberals who are all concerned about campaign finance reform are all very, very happy to talk to people like the Democracy Alliance, who I would love to give you a full membership list of, but it's confidential.
Yes. Donor list.
Donors. Well, to the extent the Democracy Alliance is an organization that takes in money, a donor list, but really it's a membership organization.
So that's Demand Justice and People for the American Way, but there's some others on the left-hand side of the ledger.
Yeah, we mentioned People for the American Way, but the other sort of old guard liberal judicial policy groups, you have the Alliance for Justice, again, heavily funded by the usual suspects, Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, Ford Foundation. Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, for those who don't remember our discussion on Planned Parenthood a few episodes ago, is the largest private funder of abortion and contraception in certainly the United States, probably the world. Alliance for Justice also takes money from the Soros Network, the Open Society Foundations, Neo-Philanthropy, labor unions, and other. They've even taken some money from other liberal organizations like the Natural Resources Defense Council. And
now, let's stop you right there. Isn't that interesting? Environmentalists, you don't normally think of judicial nominations and environmentalists, but apparently there's a link.
There is a link, and it has to do with the fact that environmentalist organizations are much less about conservation, actual preservation of lands and so forth than they used to be, and they're now a lot about government policy and government regulation. I believe the NRDC is headed by a former Obama administration EPA official. Rhea Sun Soo is her name.
Well, lots of revolving doors between the environmental
lots of revolving
groups
doors between the environmental groups and the regulatory arms of the government during the Obama administration.
Yes, and I will throw out there as well that you talked about how important the regulations, the administrative state, and the court system, which is going to oversee that as well, how important that is to environmentalists. My best example of that to me in recent years would be one of the most outrageous things the Obama administration did was its so-called clean energy plan,
Clean Power Plan.
Clean Power Plan, which was, I won't remotely bore readers with getting in the weeds of, but it was a very technical but very it was a very technical twist in regulations that would have had that was obscure but would have had a huge effect on the cost of your electricity bill every single month. It would have driven it up greatly. And the way that it was handled in the regulatory process was completely outrageous. They didn't follow any of the laws or regulations governing the regulatory process. And if you do outrages like that against the rule of law, you need to have justices that don't care about the rule of law to go, oh, fine, we'll wave that through. No, yeah, whatever. So I just make that point that that's right. Another reason that the stakes in these battles are really high.
Yeah, the influence It is unfortunate that the courts have this much influence over over our lives, but they do.
Yes, and for more on the Clean Power Plan, just go to capitalresearch.org. So there's another big group we should get to here as well.
And then, so the American Constitution Society, which is both factions, the conservatives have the Federalist Society, who we'll get to. The liberals have the American Constitution Society. You've noted that originally it was called the Madison Society, but because
Madison was the so-called father of the Constitution, but between that sort of patriarchy sound and the fact that he owned slaves, they changed the name. But yeah, it was originally it came after the Federalist Society, right, designed to be the anti-Federalist Society.
Yeah, designed to be for the Federalist Society is for conservative lawyers to develop conservative legal philosophy. ACS is the Liberal Lawyers Association to further develop liberal living constitutionalist judicial philosophy, again, funded by the usual suspects. most of which we've discussed here, and they're a little bit newer than Alliance for Justice. They've been around since 2001.
Okay. Well, then let's turn to the conservative side of the ledger. The most obvious and famous at this point would be the Federalist Society that you've mentioned.
Yeah, like I mentioned, they're the conservative legal policy development people. They are very close with the Trump administration. I believe it has now been announced that Leonard Leo,
their vice president,
their vice president, has taken a leave of absence from the Federalist Society. One presumes that is to advise the government or the nominee on the confirmation process.
Yes, Leonard has done. Leonard always takes leaves of absence from the Federalist Society, which is 501c3, and therefore cannot properly be fighting for a Senate vote on a nominee. So he takes leave of absence to help run that. Other very important thought leaders in that world would also be Ed Whalen, who blogs at National Review's Bench Memos.
He's with the Ethics and Public Policy Center.
Yeah, he's head of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and another one of the sharpest guys on the conservative side for these things. And to say a little bit more about the Federalist Society, this is a great philanthropy lesson too, because what happened was there was a conservative foundation called the John M. Oland Foundation, which is now gone because it spent itself down.
It has spent it, rather than like the Ford Foundation, giving itself perpetual existence so that it can then be hijacked by the liberal children and the liberal program staff. It spent itself into non-existence before that could happen.
Yes, while it was still conservative. And all it did was give a relatively small amount of money to have a summer conference of great legal scholars like Judge Bork, like Scalia, like my great con law professor, Walter Burns, and some other faculty at law schools and some students. They just had a summer conference, which happens all the time. As I say, it was a pittance as far as money goes, but it was wildly successful because conservatives in legal academe were so upset about how crazy things were going on the activist direction. And it was because of its great success, it was decided, well, hey, we ought to make this into an actual institution, and that's how the Federalist Society was born. Now, the great neoconservative godfather, so-called Irving Kristol, who was very influential both intellectually but also in philanthropy, he was, I believe, on the board of Oland at the time, and in retrospect called it the greatest Oland grant of all time, because the Federalist Society has had such...
And that's a reasonable assessment.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't believe there is a law school in America that does not have a Federalist Society chapter, and then obviously you have...
it has been a fertile ground for growing future Republican-nominated conservative originalist judges and lawyer advocates.
No. So, and the two great, if you want to dig deeper into this, folks, you can look at two books. One, the Philanthropy Roundtable, published during my time there by John Miller, called Strategic Investment and Ideas. And from the left-hand side, Stephen Tellez wrote The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, which is a good history on this, that the Federalist Society, or FedSoc as it's called, they cooperated with, even though he was a big liberal, and it was for Princeton University Press. But there's a lot to be learned there. One of the things, by the way, that's to be learned there is that had Judge Bork not been martyred by the left, you might not have had, maybe the Federalist Society would have petered out, because within 2 years of his martyrdom, the Federalist Society had double the funding.
Not only is it a great recruiting tool when the other side raises the stakes are always raised.
Yes.
they don't go back to being the stakes that they were before, which is, we're going to get to that in a moment.
Yes, and in fact, we should add, speaking of that martyrdom, we should discuss the attempted martyrdom of Clarence Thomas, who was a George H.W. Bush nominee, and was about to get voted on by the Senate when all of a sudden there was
a dubiously sourced allegation that he had done improper things in a previous position.
Yeah, spoken improper words, really, but as about what it amounted to. But at the time, we had different standards at the time.
We had different standards at the time,
and it was quite shocking. And the Judiciary Committee came back and held more hearings. But in the end, he still, despite the hearings that were going on, and it was pretty clear that Thomas was a fiercely righteous man, and
was innocent of the charges,
and denied all this. And every woman who had ever worked with Thomas, just about, testified what a good guy was. One thing I remember is in a House of Representatives office where you're jammed in like lemmings, the women said that not only had they never heard him ever utter anything salacious, they had never heard him utter a curse word in a House of Representatives office.
Which would be the first time that anyone was in a House of Representatives office and didn't utter a swear word.
Yes, so anyway, somehow the American people, by 60% or more, believed Clarence Thomas. But 1 year later, the same poll was taken because, of course, the left-wing media had a constant drumbeat that, oh, well, he was accused of these pretty awful things, and we all kind of know, he squeaked in somehow. And a year later, the same poll is taken, and a majority of Americans said they did not believe Clarence Thomas. So if you wonder why conservatives get angry about left-wing bias in the media.
Of course, it ultimately doesn't matter because Mr. Justice Thomas has been Mr. Justice Thomas for 26 years.
Yes.
26 years and counting as of when we sat down to record.
Now, there's another conservative group that we should talk about as well.
Yes, that's the Judicial Crisis Network. We mentioned that Demand Justice is looking to spend $10 million opposing whoever gets nominated and other Trump administration nominees for the lower courts. Well, the Judicial Crisis Network is the conservative group that is going to defend the nominee. They have promised a, quote, 7-figure campaign to support whoever gets nominated, and one also presumes to support nominees for the lower courts.
Yep. And I will say that I have never confirmed this story with anyone, but I believe that it's quite likely to be true, which is that Judicial Crisis Network was in some ways the brainchild of Karl Rove,
and that would be smart. As we mentioned, we've mentioned Bork, we've mentioned now Thomas. Let's mention a third, Miguel Estrada. In 2003, he was nominated to the D.C. Circuit
to be in the
on deck circle for a potential Supreme Court vacancy. And the Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, who is now the Senate Minority Leader, he was at the time Minority Whip, I think. They led a filibuster, a minority blockade of his nomination, in part because Estrada was Latino. And although, and that sort of started the snowballing that led to the first threats to get rid of the judicial filibuster in 2006 that were set aside by a compromise, the ultimate decision by Harry Reid to get rid of the judicial filibuster in 2013, and Mitch McConnell confirming Neil Gorsuch by overriding the filibuster and getting rid of it for Supreme Court nominations. And now, again, the Democrats have said they're going to go to war to the knife, but the question is what weapon, they don't have very many options to block it because the Republicans have the Senate majority.
Yes, although we'll touch on in a second that there's a few tricky things on that to some degree. But no, the story that I had heard, though I never confirmed it with Karl, was that he precisely said, look, the other side has all these other pressure groups, and the Federalist Society is not a pressure group. The Federalist Society is a C3.
Right. It's a sort of backwards American Constitution society. Now,
yeah. Well,
the ACS is created to be the intellectual counterpart to FedSoc. JCN is created to be the activist pressure campaign counterpart to People for the American Way.
Yes. Although we should also, it occurs to me, to be fair on the pressure groups back and forth, that the Federalist Society was not completely clear when it was first starting. Is this just going to be sort of a think tanky kind of thing, or is it going to be a broader membership thing? And again, the Bork martyrdom made a difference because the American Bar Association played a very big role in defeating Bork. In fact, 5 members, I believe, of the committee to give a rating of Bork refused to say that he was qualified, which was laughable on its face since he was one of the leading scholars in America. So that helped to persuade the Federalist Society's leaders that we need to have a large membership society that is like the American Bar Association, and that is exactly what they've created.
Conserve as a counterpart. So moving on, I mentioned that this is going to be war to the knife, and you mentioned that Demand Justice is probably, as we speak, still standing on the Supreme Court with their fill-in-the-blank signs. The the liberals and Demand Justice are demanding that President Trump break his promise to choose from the list that we mentioned earlier, the list that is widely believed. I believe have they confirmed that Federalist Society was consulted on the list, or
I don't think there's any.
There is. It is widely and universally believed that people related to the Federalist Society assisted in the compilation of the list. Now, as we all know, President Trump has been known to spoil for a fight. And I think this is one that Senate Republicans will insist that he take, even if I don't think he's ever had the instinct to back down on anything in his life, other than casinos in Atlantic City. So we're gonna have the war to the knife.
Yes, and the other thing we're gonna have is people insisting that they're just defending a process in principle.
Yeah, process arguments. I will refer to the principle, which I call Barone's law, after the AEI political analyst and friend of the Capital Research Center, Michael Barone, who succinctly put it: all process arguments are insincere, including this one. The Democrats, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, most of the Democrats in the Senate have said, hey, wait a minute, in 2016 when Antonin Scalia died, Mitch McConnell, you didn't have a vote on President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland. Well, it's an election year. We should have no vote on, we should let the people decide and have no vote on whoever gets nominated. Of course, in 2010, the Democratic President Barack Obama nominated liberal Justice Elena Kagan, and the Senate Democrats confirmed Elena Kagan. Now, of course, there's a little, it's a little awkward. Obviously a presidential election and a midterm election are different, and historically the precedents are different. There have been 9 modern era nominations of completed confirmations of a nominee in a midterm election year. Unsurprisingly, almost all of those, the Senate and the president were of the same party, and the one that wasn't was David Souter, who might as well have been.
Yes.
So, expect a lot of insincere process arguments to be made in this debate over the next couple months.
No, that is a certainty, and the other thing to mention is that we said it before, but Republicans do not have anything like the record of Democrats when it comes to their nominees making them happy in the long term. It is worth remembering that Reagan and George H.W. Bush literally appointed a majority of the Supreme Court at the time, and yet regularly
still had William Rehnquist, a Nixon appointee who actually was a conservative, on the court.
Yes, as Chief Justice.
As Chief Justice. Mm-hmm. But because obviously Souter basically did the full flip, the full Jen Rubin, and became a hard liberal after he was nominated, and because Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy were inconsistent weather vanes, the Republican record of judicial appointments is not great. That's one of the reasons that Federal Society exists, to build an intellectual framework under which you get less weather vane justices.
Yes. The other thing that we should point out, and folks might even remember this one, is George W. Bush had the very unusual case of putting forth a nominee, which was his White House counsel, Harriet Miers, with whom I did overlap. In fact, she vetted me for when I was coming on the Domestic Policy Council, so she got to be the one to ask me if I've had affairs or am I a big drug user and all that. But luckily, I'm a very boring guy. But she was nominated with the president thinking that, well, look, he nominated her because he thought, this is somebody I've known for years.
Right, this is somebody I know. This is somebody I know and trust. And the Senate Republicans said, nope, try again.
Yeah, well, and the broader conservative movement. I mean, Laura Ingraham, for instance, and folks like that were furious because Harriet Miers was not considered
because Harriet Miers had no judicial record of having judged in actual cases of judging.
Yes, well, and they wanted another Scalia or Bork, who are giants of intellect,
and they ended up getting Samuel Alito,
apparently this was not a bad idea.
Who authored my favorite decision of the last term of the recently completed Supreme Court term, Janice v. Asked Me, holding that government worker unions do not have the power to force dissident non-members to pay them agency fees.
Yes, and Kennedy joined him on that case, making the 5-4. But so it was interesting that the Republicans rebelled against their own nominee, as it were, and that turned out well for them. There will certainly be, I mean, you talked about how the Republicans, right this second, theoretically, the Republicans have a majority of votes in the Senate, and of course they have, if there's a tie, Mike Pence breaks a tie, but there are at least 3 people who are a little touch and go. One is Senator McCain.
One is Senator John McCain, who is currently undergoing brain cancer treatment and may not be available to vote.
Yes, he may not even be able to vote. Plus, he is notorious for surprising people and not going along with the party. Although I can't recall him ever doing
somebody was passing around all the Republican senators who had voted against a judicial nomination going back to Bork. McCain is not one of them.
Yeah, so that isn't too likely, but the health issue is
the health issue is serious.
Although if he were to either die or resign,
Republican Governor Doug Ducey would appoint a replacement through, I think, 2020.
So
there's a possibility if his vote is absolutely necessary that arrangements could be made.
And then but then there also are a couple of senators on the Republican side who are off.
Right, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski.
I don't know if they have publicly said that they won't vote for someone who won't pledge to support Roe v. Wade, but I know privately at least one of them has said that.
There is, both of them are pro-choice, both of them are friends of Planned Parenthood, both of them are friends of the teachers union, and they hold theoretically the balance of power. Now, that list that was being passed around the other day, neither has voted against a Republican Supreme Court nomination that made it to the floor. So if it came to that, again, they're going to have consultation, and they may be a break on the appointment of somebody like Judge Pryor, very staunch, very aggressive social conservative from Alabama. But if a mainstream, I mean, both of them voted for Neil Gorsuch. Importantly, both of them voted to break the filibuster for Neil Gorsuch. I would be surprised if if a nominee in the mold of Neil Gorsuch, if they defected.
Yes, and of course there are all kinds of theories floating around.
That somehow any of the dissident Republican senators who don't like the president would somehow throw it away just to spite the president. That's wishful thinking. I loathe the president, but if you appoint someone from his list, I will loathe anyone who votes against who opposes anyone on the list.
Yes. This is one of the tricky things that judicial philosophy unites all the branches of conservatism. The sternest never Trumper has never criticized Trump on his judges.
And the factional, and all the factional divides. There are going to be some conservative justices libertarians aren't going to like, and some libertarian justices that social conservatives aren't going to like. But generally and broadly, that somebody with a good and established record is going to unite the factions of the conservative movement in a way that a fight over tariffs or a fight over foreign policy is going to fracture everyone.
Yes, no. So this is a big help for the House and Senate, even though the House isn't going to vote on House and Senate midterms.
Well, it could be because here's the galaxy brain take. Let's assume that the Republicans get a good nominee and get him through, which means that for at least 2 years, the conservative bloc, obviously this is all contingent on the health of the justices, but the conservatives are going to have a check on at least one branch, and 2 branches for the 2 years that President Trump's first term. That it may the question is, will it calm conservative voters to say, okay, we're good for a little while, or will it rally them promise kept Republican senators, even the Republican senators I don't like voted for it. Are they going to be rallied? I think that there's a balancing on either side, and of course there's equal opposite reactions. The left is going to mobilize. Demand Justice is going to be out there getting names, getting petition signatures that they're going to hit up for they're going to rent that list and hit up for resources and hit up for reminders to engage in the political process. I think you're going to see intensity. You're going to see intensity on both sides, and I'm not sure who's going to benefit in a purely political sense, in a purely punditological sense. I think there are pressures on both sides in both ways, and of course, if, as seems fairly likely, the Democrats fail to defeat the nomination of a mainstream conservative nominee, is that going to then depress liberals who got all hotted up to defeat the nomination? Yep. In Republicans experienced that in 2013 with the fight over quote unquote defund Obamacare. I think there was probably some deflation when that ultimately failed. Of course, then after a year, they won the 2014 elections that proved so consequential because they kept Merrick Garland off the Supreme Court. So
definitely goes back and forth a lot.
Everybody gets. This is a mobile thing. Everybody gets to push and everybody gets to play and everyone is going to be in the game. And any projection that is based on the assumption that somebody's going to sit out the game, I think at this point goes out the window.
Absolutely. Well, that is our show for this week. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, you should know that we broadcast a live video version of this podcast at 10 a.m. on Thursdays on Facebook Live and YouTube. You can find our pages by searching Capital Research Center. And if you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.